Hello, fifth graders. We are starting our third read aloud of The Thief of Always. We have a ton to read today, so I'm going to get started right away. Something like 4 chapters. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Oops, I think we left off on chapter 4. That's right, chapter 4, A Death Between Seasons. The sun came to wake him soon after dawn, a straight white dart of light laid on his lids. He sat up with a start, wondering for a moment what bed this was, what room, what house. Then his memories of the previous day returned, and he realized that he'd slept through from late afternoon to early morning. The rest had strengthened him. He felt energetic, and with a whoop of pleasure, he jumped out of bed and got dressed. The house was more welcoming than ever today. The flowers Mrs. Griffin had set on every table, and still, singing with color. The front door stood open, and sliding down the gleaming banisters, Harvey raced out onto the porch to inspect the morning. A surprise awaited him. The trees, which had been heavy with leaves the previous afternoon, had shed their canopies. There were new, tiny buds on every branch and twig, as though this were its first day of spring. Another day, another dollar, said Wendell, ambling around the corner of the house. What does that mean? Said Harvey. It's what my father used to say all the time. Another day, another dollar. He's a banker, my dad, Wendell Hamilton the second, and me, I'm Wendell Hamilton the third. How'd you know? Lucky guess. I'm Harvey. Yeah, I know. Do you like the tree houses? I never had one. Wendell pointed up at the tallest tree. There was a platform perched up amongst the branches with a rudimentary house built upon it. I've been working up there for weeks, said Wendell, but I can't get it finished alone. You want to help me? Sure, but I've got to eat something first. Go and eat. I'll be around. Harvey headed back inside and found Mrs. Griffin setting out a breakfast fit for a prince. There was milk spilt on the floor and a cat with a tail hooked like a question mark lapping it up. Clue Cat? He said. Yes, indeed, Mrs. Griffin said fondly. He's the wicked one. Clue Cat looked up as if he knew he was being talked about. Then he jumped up on the table and searched amongst the plates of pancakes and waffles for something more to eat. Can he do whatever he likes? Harvey said, watching the cat sniff at this and that. I mean, does nobody control him? Ah, well, we all have somebody watching over us, don't we? Mrs. Griffin replied, whether we like it or not. Now eat. You've got some wonderful times ahead of you. Harvey didn't need a second invitation. He dug into his second meal at the holiday house with even more appetite than he had the first, and then headed out to meet the day. Oh, what a day it was! The breeze was warm and smelt of the green scent of growing things. The perfect sky was full of swooping birds. He sauntered through the grass, his hands in his pockets, like the lord of all he surveyed, calling to Wendell as he approached the trees. Can I come up? If you've got a head for heights, Wendell dared him. The ladder creaked as he climbed, but he made the platform without missing a step. Wendell was impressed. Not bad for a new boy, he said. We had 2 kids here who couldn't even get up halfway. Where'd they go? Back home, I suppose. Kids come and go, you know. Harvey peered out through the branches upon which every bud was bursting. You can't see much, can you? He said. I mean, there's no sign of the town at all. Who cares? Said Wendell. It's just gray out there anyway. And it's sunny here, Harvey said, staring down at the wall of misty stones that divided the grounds of the house from the outside world. How's that possible? Wendell's answer was the same again. Who cares? He said. I know I don't. Now, are we going to start building or what? They spent the next 2 hours working on the treehouse, descending a dozen times to dig through the timbers heaped beside the orchard, looking for boards to finish their repairs. By noon, they'd not only found enough wood to fix the roof, but they had each found a friend. Harvey liked Wendell's bad jokes, and that who cares, which found its way into every other sentence. And Wendell seemed just as happy to have Harvey's company. You're the first kid who's been real fun, he said. What about Lulu? What about her? Isn't she any fun? She was okay when I first arrived, Wendell admitted. I mean, she's been here months, so she kind of showed me the place. But she's got weird the last few days. I see her sometimes wandering around like she's sleepwalking, with a blank expression on her face. She's probably going crazy, Harvey said. Her brain's turning to mush. Do you know about that stuff? Wendell wanted to know, his face lighting up with ghoulish delight. Of course I do, Harvey lied. My dad's a surgeon. Wendell was most impressed by this, and for the next few minutes listened in gaping envy as Harvey told him about all the operations he'd seen. Skulls sawn open and legs sawn off, feet sewn on where hands used to be, and a man with a boil on his behind that grew into a talking head. You swear? Said Wendell. I swear, said Harvey. That's so cool. All this talk brought on a fierce hunger, and at Wendell's suggestion, they climbed down the ladder and wandered into the house to eat. What do you want to do this afternoon? He asked Harvey as they sat down at the table. It's going to be really hot. It always is. Is there anywhere we can swim? Wendell frowned. Well, yes, he said doubtfully. There's a lake around the other side of the house, but you won't much like it. Why not? The water's so deep you can't see the bottom. Are there any fish? Oh, sure. Maybe we could catch some. Mrs. Griffin could cook 'em up for us. At this, Mrs. Griffin, who was at the stove piling up a plate with onion rings, gave a little shout and dropped the plate. She turned to Harvey, her face ashen. You don't want to do that, she said. Why not? Harvey replied. I thought I could do whatever I wanted. Well, yes, of course you can, she told him, but I wouldn't want you to get sick. The fish are poisonous, you see. Oh, said Harvey. Well, maybe we won't eat them after all. Look at this mess, Mrs. Griffin said, fussing to cover her confusion. I need a new apron. She hurried away to fetch one, leaving Harvey and Wendell to exchange puzzled looks. Now I really have to see those fish, Harvey said. As he spoke, the ever-inquisitive Clue Cat jumped up onto the counter beside the stove, and before either of the boys could move to stop him, he had his paws up on the lip of one of the pans. Hey, get down, Harvey told him. The cat didn't care to take orders. He hoisted himself up onto the rim of the pan to sniff at its contents, his tail flicking back and forth. The next moment, disaster. The tail danced too close to one of the burners and burst into flames. Clue Cat yowled and tipped over the pan as he perched upon. A wave of boiling water washed him off the top of the stove, and he fell to the ground in a smoking heap. Whether drowned, scalded, or incinerated, the end was the same. He hit the floor, dead. The din brought Mrs. Griffin hurrying back. I think I'm going to go and eat outside, Wendell said as the old woman appeared at the door. He snatched up a couple of hot dogs and was gone. Oh, my Lord, Miss Griffin cried when she set eyes on the dead cat. Oh, you foolish thing. It was an accident, Harvey said, sickened by what had happened. He was up on the stove. Foolish thing, was all Miss Griffin seemed to be able to say. She sank down onto her knees and stared at the sad little sack of burned fur. No more questions from you, she finally murmured. The sight of Mrs. Griffin's unhappiness made Harvey's eyes sting, but he hated to have anyone see him cry. So he fought back his tears as best he could and said, Shall I help you bury him? In his gruffest voice. Mrs. Griffin looked around. That's very sweet of you, she said softly, but there's no need. You go out and play. I don't want to leave you on your own, Harvey said. Oh, look at you, child, Miss Griffin said. You've got tears on your cheeks. Harvey blushed and wiped them away with the back of his hand. Don't be ashamed to weep, Mrs. Griffin said. It's a wonderful thing. I wish I could still shed a tear or two. You're sad, Harvey said. I can see that. What I feel is not quite sadness, Mrs. Griffin replied, and it's not much solace either, I'm afraid. What's solace? Harvey asked. It's something soothing, Mrs. Griffin said, getting to her feet. Something that heals the pain in your heart. And you don't have any of that? No, I don't, Mrs. Griffin said. She reached out and touched Harvey's cheeks. Except maybe in these tears of yours. They comfort me. She sighed as she traced their tracks of her fingers. Your tears are sweet, child, and so are you. Now you go out into the light and enjoy yourself. There's sun on the step, and it won't be there forever. Believe me. Are you sure? I'm sure. I'll see you later then, Harvey said, and headed out into the afternoon. At this point, this would be a good point to pause the video and start to reflect on Mrs. Griffin as a character. I want you to write down what you're thinking about her, what you're noticing about her. She's definitely not an average person. You can comment on her physical attributes and some of her emotional character traits as well. And these two pictures. Chapter 5, The Prisoners. The temperature had risen while Harvey had been at lunch, a heat-hazed hover over the lawn, which was lusher and more thick with flowers than he remembered, and it made the trees around the house shimmer. He headed down towards them, calling Wendell's name as he went. There was no reply. He glanced back towards the house, thinking he might see Wendell at one of the windows, but they were all reflecting the pristine blue. He looked from house to heavens. There was not a cloud in sight. And now a suspicion stole upon him, which grew into a certainty as his gaze wandered back to the shimmering copse and the flowers underfoot. During the hours he'd spent in the cool of the kitchen, the season had changed. Summer had come to Mr. Hood's holiday house, a summer as magical as the spring that had preceded it. That's why the sky was so faultlessly blue and the birds making such music. The leaf-laden branches were no less content, nor the blossoms in the grass, nor the bees that buzzed from bloom to bloom, gathering the season's bounty. All were in bliss. It would not be a long season, Harvey guessed. If the spring had been over in a morning, then most likely this perfect summer would not outlast the afternoon. I'd better make the most of it, he thought, and he hurried in search of Wendell. He finally discovered his friend sitting in the shade of the tree with a pile of comics at his side. Want to sit down and read? He asked. Maybe later, said Harvey. First, I want to go and look at this lake you were talking about. Are you going to come? What for? I told you it's no fun. All right, I'll go on my own. You won't stay long, Wendell remarked, and went back to his reading. Though Harvey had a good idea of the lake's general whereabouts, the bushes on that side of the house were thick and thorny, and it took him several minutes to find a way through them. By the time he caught sight of the lake itself, the sweat on his face and back was clammy, and his arms had been scratched and bloodied by barbs. As Wendell had predicted, the lake wasn't worth the trouble. It was large, so large that the far side was barely visible, but gloomy and drear, both the lake and the dark stones around it covered with a film of green scum. There was a legion of flies buzzing around in search of something rotten to feed on, and Harvey guessed they'd have no trouble finding a feast. This was a place where dead things belonged. He was about to leave when a movement in the shadows caught his eye. Somebody was standing further along the bank, almost eclipsed by the mesh of thicket. He moved a few paces closer to the lake and saw that it was Lulu. She was perched on the slimy stones at the very edge of the water, gazing into their depths. Speaking in a near whisper for fear he'd startle her, Harvey said, "It looks cold." She glanced up at him, her face full of confusion, and then, without a word of reply, turned and bounded away through the bushes. "Wait," Harvey called, hurrying towards the lake. Lulu had already disappeared, however, leaving the thicket shaking. He might have gone in pursuit of her, except the sound of bubbles breaking in the lake took his gaze to the waters, and there, moving just below the coat of scum, he saw the fish. They were almost as large as he was, their gray scales stained and encrusted, their bulbous eyes turned up towards the surface like the eyes of prisoners in a watery pit. They were watching him, he was certain of that, and their scrutiny made him shudder. Were they hungry, he wondered, and praying to their fishy gods that he'd slip on the stones and tumble in? Or were they wishing he'd come with a rod and a line so that they could be hauled out of the depths and put out of their misery? What a life, he thought. No sun to warm them, no flowers to sniff or games to play. Just the deep, dark waters to circle in, and circle, and circle, and circle. It made him dizzy just watching, and he feared that if he lingered much longer, he'd lose his balance and join them. Gasping with relief, he turned his back on the sight and returned into the sunlight as fast as the barbs would allow. Wendell was still sitting underneath the tree. He had 2 bottles of ice-cold lemonade in the grass beside him, and lobbed one to Harvey as he approached. "Well," he said. "You were right," Harvey replied. "Nobody in their right mind ever goes there." "I saw Lulu." "What did I tell you?" Wendell crowded. "Nobody in their right mind. And those fish." "Well, yeah, I know," Wendell said, pulling a face. "Ugly boogers, aren't they?" "Why would Mr. Hood have fish like that? I mean, everything else is so beautiful. The lawns, the house, the orchard." Now I want you to think. Why would Mr. Hood have fish like that? Take a moment and think about it. This is something you can also jot down in your reading journal online. Why would Mr. Hood have fish like that? Moving on. "Who cares?" said Wendell. "I do," said Harvey. "I want to know everything there is to know about this place." "Why?" "So I can tell my mom and dad about it when I go home." "Home?" said Wendell. "Who needs it? We've got everything we need here." I'd still like to know how all this works. Is there some kind of machine making the seasons change? Wendell pointed up through the branches at the sun. Does that look mechanical to you? He said. Don't be a dope, Harvey. This is all real. It's magic, but it's real. You think so? It's too hot to think, Wendell replied. Now sit down and shut up. He tossed a few comics in Harvey's direction. Look through these. Find yourself a monster for tonight. What's happening tonight? Halloween, of course, Wendell said. It happens every night. Harvey plunked himself down beside Wendell, opened his bottle of lemonade, and began to leaf through the comics, thinking as he leafed and sipped that maybe Wendell was right, and it was too hot to think. However, this miraculous place worked. It seemed real enough. The sun was hot, the lemonade was cold, the sky was blue, the grass was green. What more did he need to know? Somewhere in the middle of these musings, he must have dozed off, because he woke with a start to find that the sun was no longer dappling the ground around him, and Wendell was no longer reading at his side. He reached for his lemonade, but the bottle had fallen over, and the sweet scent had attracted hundreds of ants. They were crawling over it and into it, many drowning for their greed. As he got to his feet, the first real breeze he'd felt since noon blew, and a leaf, its edges sere, spiraled down to land at his feet. Autumn, he murmured to himself. Until this moment, standing beneath the creaked boughs, watching the wind shake down the leaves, autumn had always seemed to him the saddest of seasons. It meant that summer was over and the nights would be growing long and cold. But now, as the drizzle of leaves became a deluge and the patter of acorns and chestnuts a drumming, he laughed to see and hear its coming. By the time he was out from under the trees, he had leaves in his hair and down his back and was kicking them up with every racing step. As he reached the porch, the first clouds he'd seen all afternoon crept over the sun, and their shadow made the house, which had wavered in the heat of the afternoon like a mirage, suddenly loom, dark and solid. You're real, he said, as he stood panting on the porch. You are, aren't you? He started to laugh at the foolishness of talking to a house, but the smile went from his face as a voice, so soft he was barely certain he heard it, said, What do you think, child? He looked for the speaker, but there was nobody at the threshold, nor out on the porch, nor on the steps behind him. Who said that? He demanded. There was no answer, which he was glad of. It hadn't been a voice at all, he told himself. It had been a creak of the boards underfoot, or the rustling of dry leaves in the grass. But he stepped into the house with his heart beating a little faster, reminding himself as he went that questions weren't welcome here. What did it matter, anyway, he thought, whether this was a real place or a dream? It felt real, and that was all that mattered. Satisfied with this, he raced through the house into the kitchen where Mrs. Griffin was weighing the table down with treats. All right, we are actually going to stop there. I'm going to have us maybe watch 2 videos today, but that's where we are going to end. I will see you again tomorrow or right after this.